Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to demonstrate how to create a simple jellyfish animation. So you can see here the jellyfish appear to be pushing themselves through the water and they've got some tentacles that are following along with them. And I've added a few plankton into the water as well. This is done in Eevee, so there are some limitations on what we can do with lighting and materials, but I think the end result is not bad. I also added a little effect to sort of simulate the effect of waves on the surface shining down through the water. So to begin with, let's create our jellyfish model. I tried a number of different ways to do this, but the one that ended up working the best was probably the simplest approach. So I'm going to start with a UV sphere, and that's quite useful just in the way that it works for this particular approach. And go into edit mode and wireframe, and we'll just select this area. We'll scale Z -1 and then GZ and move that up to about here. And then what I'm going to do is E, click, and then GZ. Just reduce the selection a bit. It doesn't have to be too precise. You're not really going to see much of this. It's just to give the body of the jellyfish some thickness. There are other ways of doing this, using modifiers, for example. I'm going to do this very simply, so this will be a slightly simpler model than I created. So when you do this, you may want to increase the number of subdivisions, at least on the vertical axis. So I'm going to select all of those. I've just pressed Alt and just with face selected and just clicked in the middle area, and that selected the ring. And now I'm going to select, checker deselect, and then E, click, and then GZ. As you pull them down, go a particular distance, don't go too far, and then E, click again, GZ. And all we're doing really is just creating some subdivisions on which the cloth modifier can work. Lots of other ways to do this, of course. I'm trying to do it with the least number of operations. You may want to increase the number of subdivisions for a given distance as you get towards the end of the tentacle, just to help it be a little more flexible, as it were, in those areas. I'm going to turn on proportional editing. I'm going to change this setting up here for the pivot point to individual origins. I'm going to say scale, and I'm going to scale that influence circle up. In fact, I'm going to say scale Shift Z, and that will just thin down the ends there. So there's the beginnings of our creature. I'm going to add subdivision surface. If you don't want that area there, you can obviously add some more loops and pull them up, but I'm quite happy with that. And I'm going to select it and say shade smooth. So now we'll go back to vertex select, go to wireframe, and we'll select this set of vertices, and we'll go one more, and we'll see how that looks. And we'll come down to here, vertex properties, and click the plus here. We'll call this pinning, and we'll assign. So just check that by selecting it. So this is essentially the main body of the jellyfish. So next we want to apply some movement to the jellyfish, as at the moment he's not doing anything. So we're going to come to the modifiers, and we're going to add a wave modifier. So if I just press play now, you can see we're already on our way to getting something along the lines of what we need. I'm just going to put in the defaults as defaults what I used before, and then we'll see how that goes. So I had it affecting both X and Y, otherwise it would have been a bit of a strange shape. I didn't use fall off. I had a height of about 0.87, so let's try that. I had a width of about 1.3, so not far from the default. I had a narrowness of 0.6, and then the speed I had at 0.08. You can see we're starting to get towards what we want. And again, you will always have to make adjustments to this. And when you make multiple copies of this, you will want to change the speed slightly. And that way they won't all be fully synchronized. They may start synchronized, but they'll quickly get out of sync. And I set damping to 0 as well. Something I experimented with was trying along normals, and occasionally that gave an interesting effect. But you can see the problem with that is it affects rather dramatically the tentacles as well. An interesting effect, but not really what I was looking for. I guess you can turn off Z, but then you're pretty much back to where you started. So I didn't use that in the end. You can use fall off to alter the way that it affects other things. So you might want to use a combination of fall off and along normals. So you can play around with the narrowness and things like that to get the effect you're looking for. So there I set it even lower than I used in my other simulation. But you see you need to change some of the other settings as well. So we'll go with that for now and we'll see how it gets on. So the next thing I want to do is make the tentacles respond to this movement that's going on at the top. So I made them part of this intentionally. Originally I tried making them in a separate object and then attaching them, but I found making them part of the same object was the simplest approach. So we're now going to add another modifier via the physics properties, which is the cloth modifier. So I went with the default for the quality, and the speed multiplier I left at 1. I set the mass up slightly at 0.5, probably doesn't matter too much. Stiffness and compression and shear I left at defaults, and bending as well. I left damping in all its defaults too. I didn't turn on internal springs or pressure. Under shape, I selected the pinning group that I'd created. It's important to turn on dynamic mesh because this is now an animated mesh. It's changing shape and things like that. So I need to make sure that the cloth modifier recognizes that. And that's all I did for the cloth modifier. So let's see how that works. Now this is going to need to bake as it goes. So this is going to be a little bit slow. You can see the frame rate's quite low there. So what I'm going to do, I'll come up to the cache and we'll set the end to 100 frames. And I'll also set the animation end to 100 frames for the moment. And then we'll bake that. And you can see the bake progressing down here. Cloth simulations do tend to be a little slow. So we can now play that and see how that's doing. Now at the moment, there's nothing else causing those tentacles to move around. So we're not going to see a great deal of effect. So the next thing I did was add into the scene a force field. So we'll just select a turbulence field. I'll just put it over here somewhere. It doesn't really matter because we're not going to limit its range. I left it as a point field. I set the strength up to 250. I set the size to 2. So this is the size of the turbulent noise, as it were. And I set flow at 7. Noise amount I set to 2.3. Speed doesn't matter really, unless you're using multiple ones. And then I'll come back to the cloth simulation, delete the bake, and bake all dynamics again. So playing that, we can now see there's a little bit more motion. We're obviously only animating a relatively short amount at the moment. And just before I bake, there's one last thing I need to change, and that is under field weights. I'll set gravity to 0, as these are essentially weightless or neutral buoyancy in water. So that's baked, and we can see what effect that's having now. So you can see we're getting some turbulence effects on the tentacles, as well as the rippling going on up here is also influencing them a little bit. I'll turn the mass of these tentacles down a little bit, I think, because on this particular model, I think they're a little heavy. So that's created our basic creature, and we just need to give it some texture now. So we'll go to EV render mode, and I'll add a lamp, which is an area light, and we'll put it over here somewhere. We'll scale it up and we'll point it somewhere in the vicinity of the jellyfish. I ended up setting this very, very bright indeed. I'm just going to set it to 120 watts for now, and I made it an ellipse. So if we go to rendered view, we'll set the background to black. So that's still a lot less than the value I use. So I've got that set to 1200 at the moment. I haven't set the EV settings yet, so it's fairly basic, but there is our creature. And this little window I've opened at the top, we'll go to the shader editor, select the jellyfish and say new under the materials, and let's start adding some nodes. So I decided to use a procedurally generated texture rather than adding an image texture. But first of all, I'm going to add under the color a hue saturation node. This is just so that I can adjust the intensity of the color, and I'll put the values that I put in. So I went up to 1.2 on that. Then I'm going to add color mix node, one side set to basically white and the other a sort of darkish red color, and I duplicated that, and another color mix node into which both of those go. Set that one to darken, and I set that up to about 0.8 thereabouts. I'll explain all of the logic behind this when we get to the end. I'm just going to connect those two. I'm going to add converter, which is a color ramp. The output of that goes to the factor on that mix node. I'm going to flip the color ramp, and then for the second point, which you can jump between points here, set it to a very tiny value, 0.005. So it almost looks as though they're on top of each other. I'm going to duplicate that node, connect that output into the other factor. And for this one, first point I set to 0.05. The second point I set to 0.291. Just by experimentation. So these are just going to filter what comes in. Next, I'm going to add a texture, which is a wave texture. I'm going to connect that into there, hold shift and then the right mouse button, and I can create a little node there as I drag it down and put the other side into there. You can see we've got a pattern appearing on here now. And if we look close, you can actually see there's two parts to it. And that's the reason for these two nodes. So one node creates this very hard, thin line, and the other node creates a much wider blurry line there. So that's the wider, less distinct line, and then I add to that the other one. I just wanted that sort of design. Then going to add an input which is texture coordinate. Before I go any further, I'm going to go into edit mode, press A to select all the geometry and press U and say sphere projection and come out. And then take UV and put that into there. Now you can see what we're heading towards. So make sure you're just straight on when you do that. You can also, of course, do it before you create the tentacles. But roughly speaking, that's that. There's a lot of different ways that you can unwrap it, but there's some stripes. I then set the scale of my wave to 7. I left the bands X and sine as default. I set the distortion to 2, so you can see that's giving us some wobbly effect there. Detail to 2.2, just very slightly increased. Detail scale to 2. Detail roughness I set to 0.238. And I just played around with the phase offset a little bit. That just really moves it around. So you can get some of these lines running down the tentacles that way. So having created our basic material, what I then did was also have my color going down into emission. Again, you can hold shift, create a node there to make things easier. I set alpha to 0.77. So that basically makes it slightly transparent. I put the index of refraction up to 1.8. I'm not sure that did an awful lot. Roughness I had at 0.3, so slightly less rough. And I set metallic up to about 0.122, so just giving it a slightly metallic effect. I put anisotropic up at 0.53. And I arrived at these values by just playing around with individual settings and seeing what it looked like. And transmission I set to 0.041. Probably didn't make a huge difference, but we'll see. I also set a subsurface, 0.255, and added a slightly yellow color. So this is where light bounces around in the surface. And that's basically all I did for the body of the jellyfish. And there's a lot more you can do with that, obviously. And I played around with the EV settings, which added glow and things like that, which we'll do at the end. So that's created our jellyfish. And now we need to add some movement. So to do that, I added curve, which is a circle. And there it is. Scale it up quite a bit. I think at this point, we'll now rotate it on the X and perhaps a bit on the Y as well. Go into edit mode, make sure all the segments are selected, right click and say subdivide, just to add a few more points to play with. And then select a couple and just start moving them around. Don't want too extreme a change of direction. And then I'm just going to move it to be coincident at some point with the jellyfish, and then Control A and apply rotation and scale. Now I'm going to select my jellyfish and I'm going to add a constraint, which is a follow path constraint. I'm going to select the path that I created, and if we press play we can start to see what's going on, and you can see it's not moving at the moment. And the reason for that, once you've added the constraint, you then need to click animate path. And now you can see that it is moving around. The cloth modifier is going a little mad at the moment, but that's fine. What I'll do is I will go to the physics properties and we will delete all bakes for the moment, and I'm going to disable the cloth modifier. So we can now see how it's moving. Obviously not quite what we want. So we'll go to the beginning of the animation and we'll just make sure the jellyfish is right where that start point is. You may just be able to see that there's a little dotted line showing where the current control point is on the curve. And I'm just making the jellyfish be about there. I'm going to click follow curve, and you can see the jellyfish is rotating, but obviously its initial rotation isn't quite right. So I'm now going to just rotate him. Doesn't have to be completely precise. So he's definitely following the curve now, which is what I wanted. Obviously moving a little fast though. So I'm going to select the curve now, go to the curve properties, under path animation. Currently it's covering the whole path in 100 frames. So if I set this to 1000 frames, obviously it won't get to the end in 100 frames, but nevertheless, each step along the path will be much smaller, and even that may not be enough. So I'm going to set this to 2000 frames. So it's now moving much more slowly. Obviously we're not animating the tentacles yet. So I'll do that now. We'll go back to the physics properties and I will re-enable my cloth modifier and bake all dynamics. So it's still moving perhaps a little fast, but you can see we're starting to get the effect we want now. And by going more slowly, the wave effect has more of an effect on the tentacles, but you can see it's starting to get there. So now I want to add the effect of waves at the surface and kind of mist coming through. I'm going to add a simple plane, scale that up and put it up there close to the lamp, and in edit mode I'm going to subdivide it a few times, not too many, so I've gone up to 10. I'm going to go to face select mode, and then I'm going to deselect all the faces and select random. You can select down here just how many of them are selected by that random. Doesn't matter too much. And then I'm going to say X, delete faces. You can create another one with a different random, or you can just duplicate this one, rotate on the Z, to be at some other angle, doesn't matter too much. And then I just lifted it up slightly so it's easy to select which one you want. There's a bit of a block there, so I'm just going to take a few more faces out there, and perhaps a couple there. So I'm just going to move this lamp, scale it up a little bit, and then I'm going to move this lamp up slightly just to make sure it's well out of the way. I'm going to enable my camera, select that, and ideally you don't want these planes visible. So let's go to rendered view. Most of the reason we can see the jellyfish now is because it's actually emitting light. And what I want to do now is go to world under my shaders and say use nodes. Once we've selected use nodes, we can see what we've got set for the background at the moment, which is just simple black color. I'm going to add another node under shaders, which is volume scatter. Connect that into the volume input. That's very important. Everything will go black at first, and then set the density. I use 0.035. Now you can see we've already got a little bit of God rays going on. So I give it a very slight pinkish color, so you can start to see we're getting our sort of God rays produced here. And now what we need to do is animate them. So I'm going to select first of all my lower plane. I'm going to change to the graph editor up here. And with that plane selected, I'm going to press I and select location. You can see we've got some lines appeared up here now, and I'm going to open up the object transform and I'm going to select the X location. Press N and that brings up some options on the right hand side, and then go to modifiers. I'm going to add a modifier which is a built-in function, which by default is the sine function. I had an amplitude of 8.2, quite a bit bigger. If I press play down here, you'll see it moving backward and forward. I had a phase multiplier of 0.05. You can see that slowed it down quite a bit. I played around with the phase offset, but it doesn't really matter too much. And the value offset again will just change the center point, which you can use really just to shift the plane around. But rather than just a simple sine wave, which may be what you want, I decided to make it slightly more complex than that. So I'll click this to copy that modifier, minimize it, and then paste it. So we've now got two versions of it. And the second version, I'll click additive. So that adds to the first one, but they're both the same right now. Change the amplitude to 4. The phase multiplier I used was 0.077. You can see we're starting to get a different waveform on there now, and then played around with the phase offset until I got a more interesting shape. So you can see it doesn't completely just go backwards and forwards, it sort of pauses a little bit and then goes on. Then I went to my second object, go to the beginning of the animation, press I to store the location, open up the modifiers and go to the Y location for this one and paste the modifier. I changed the phase multiplier to 0.07 for this one. I went for about -7 on the offset, and you may need to move it around as well. So if we start that playing, you can now see one is going up and down in X and the other is going up and down in Y. And of course, we paste a second one in, set it to additive, slightly smaller amplitude and a different phase multiplier as well as offset. So now we've got this effect going on with two different planes with holes in them. And you can now see, even in the preview, we start to get this fluctuation in the light beams that are coming through. It's not awfully obvious, but you can play around with the density of the volume. You can do it here if you want to, so we can go up to 0.05. And obviously with the preview it doesn't show up as much, but you can see there I've turned the density of the volume up a little bit, and we're now getting much more of an effect. I also turned the lamp up quite a bit as well. So you can see I actually ended up with about 1200 for the strength of my lamp, and you can see that's very, very bright. That might be a bit too bright for this scene. So perhaps we'll go with 6. I had 12,000. Perhaps we'll go with 6,000. And obviously in the preview it doesn't show all that well. Here's one of the funny things. Because I set a slightly pink colour here, it actually ends up looking at slightly greeny blue in here. This is just one of the funny ways that light works with volumetric shaders. And you can see if I stop it, you can see it has a chance to catch up and shows a lot better God rays. In terms of the EV settings I used, I turned on bloom as you might expect. I'm going to turn this lamp down a bit further. I think it's still a bit too much. So I used bloom. I had the threshold at about 0.5. You You can see we're now getting a little bit of glow there. Everything else was default. If you want to, you can add a color to the bloom, of course. There's a slight bluish hue to that color. That's up to you. I turned on screen space reflections. Not so important, but it does mean if you get any shiny parts to the scene, then that will help with those. But I left everything at default. Under volumetrics, I set the tile size to 0.2. You can see already that's a smoother, nicer volumetrics. You don't really see it when it's updating, but once it's finished updating, you get a nicer line rather than a jagged line. And I set the samples up to 256 and distribution to 0.9. Be a bit careful with that because you can easily crash Blender with that. I turned on volumetric shadows and I set those to 32. Under shadows, I set the cube size to 1024, so just basically increasing the quality, and 2048 cascade. And I set it to high bit depth and soft shadows. You can see that's softened everything up now. If I turn off soft shadows, we've got these hard lines, but with soft shadows, it's a lot more gentle. So you just get the effect of blurry light shining through the water rather than completely hard shadows and beams that you might get in slightly foggy air. Under the compositor, I just do a quick render of that scene. Because of the additions we put in there, it will take a little bit longer than a typical Eevee scene to render, but it was manageable. So I just added a couple of nodes here. I added, under color, a brightness and contrast node, and I just put the contrast up to 1. See that darken the background, but still gives us the glow, perhaps a little bit less than that for this particular scene. And then I added, under color, a hue saturation node, and I set the saturation up to 1.05. You can easily go too much on that, just to really increase some of the color in this scene a little bit. One final thing that I did was just add some little particles of sort of plankton to be floating around. So first of all, let's just create the little objects, the little creatures. So I'll just add an icosphere. It doesn't really need much detail, so I will keep that first one and we'll duplicate that. This one I will stretch a little bit. I'll just select that top and bottom point, turn on proportional editing, scale on the Z, but we need to set that to median point, something like that. And then I will GX and just move that off slightly to one side just to give it a slightly different shape. And again, something similar with this one, really just to give them some shape that's not completely symmetrical in all axes anyway. And we'll set those to shade smooth, and we'll set up a material for them. We'll make it a simple material, so I'll just use the principled shader. I set the base color to full white, and then I set a subsurface of 0.05 just to give them a subsurface scattering. I set the roughness down at 0.077, so they're quite shiny. I guess they've got a sort of silicate shell. I put transmission up to 0.655, so they're relatively see-through, and the roughness to 0.155, so they will scatter the light a little bit, and alpha to 0.577. And I also set emission to white. And there you go, they're glowing away there now. To make them semi-translucent, of course, we will also need to turn on alpha hashed or clip down here, and that's probably something I forgot to do with the jellyfish. Let's see what sort of difference that makes. With Eevee, you can't get transparency without turning this on in the material settings. It's not really making much of a difference to that. It's not necessary. In fact, you don't even have those settings in cycles. And I've turned on screen space reflections for them as well. So we'll move those to a new collection by pressing M and call it Plankton. And then we'll come back over here and we'll create a simple cube, and it just needs to enclose the area we are likely to see. I'll do it at that size for now. And I'll call this emitter, and we'll add a particle system. So we just click plus there under particle systems. Should default to emitter. I only had about 250 plankton particles. Set the lifetime to longer than the length of the animation, so I just put it up at quite a large value. And make sure that the frame start and end are at the beginning of your animation, so I've set that to 0. Under source, I changed that to volume. I turned off even distribution because although it's randomized, if it's even, it literally is a completely even distribution of particles around the scene, which obviously doesn't reflect real life that well, but left it at random order and jittered. Velocity I set down to 0.01, so very, very slow. Turned on rotation controls, left it at hair velocity for hair, but set the randomize to 0.212. I'm just giving you the settings I ended up with. Phase I set at 0.674, again doesn't matter that much because these are going to be rotating and randomized phase at about 1.4. The important thing is I clicked dynamic, and then under angular velocity I set that to 1.8. That seemed to be about the speed. So this is essentially how much each particle is rotating, and then change that to random, so they'll all be rotating in different directions. Physics I left at Newtonian. Under render we now need to set that to collection. Scale I set down slightly to 0.025, and then scale randomness at 0.5. Turned off show emitter, so effectively this box becomes invisible during render. Change that collection to the plankton collection and say pick random, and although it doesn't matter too much, I selected object rotation as well. Under field weights there's a couple of things I did. First of all, I set gravity to 0 so the particles didn't just fall. So you can see we've got some little particles in here now. If I go back to the beginning of the animation, you can see they're moving around. So they're all going around a little bit too quickly at the moment. And the reason for that, if I go to wireframe view, you may be able to see them a little better. The reason for that is because they're being affected by the force field that I'm using to affect the jellyfish. So what I then did is I actually set all force. So this is, I didn't need to look for a particular force, to a very small value. So I went to 0.0003. And now you can see they're just floating around much more slowly. If you needed to, you could select the specific force, and I'm using turbulence, so I could have just done it there. But essentially, that's how I created the jellyfish scene. So I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, let me know, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. So I hope you found that interesting. If you did, let me know. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and I now have a Patreon page as well, and I'll provide links to all of those in the description below. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.